I always wonder, is it worthwhile for us to worry about Christian leadership? I mean, does it matter that Christian communities flourish? And I just want to mention a book that has really struck me lately, partly because I was working on a project and I ended up making use of it and even emailing the author. James Davison Hunter from the University of Virginia, who, by the way, made the phrase culture wars part of our lingo. That was a title of an earlier book. Has written on democracy and solidarity, as he calls it, on the cultural roots of America's political crisis. I'm not going to read this, and I'll just say a word or two about it. He is convinced that the beginnings of American life involved not just commitments from the Enlightenment, so that we could untether ourselves in some way or other from tradition and think on our own, but also commitments that derive from the church. And he calls our initial cultural substance a hybrid enlightenment. How is that pertinent? The book then tells the story of how, over time, the sense of the importance of the church side of this has suffered. He thinks we had a shared commitment as a nation up until about the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King, even though the elites were already turning to secularism. But after that death, the fabric of the society began to fragment, and we ended up with a lot of disagreement and a lot of skepticism about the pursuit of truth or about the meaning of life. And one result of that has been, as Nietzsche might well have predicted, a kind of a doubt about whether truth-seeking and moral persuasion really are any different from just sheer will to power. And that sounds so like our current politics. And the impression he leaves is that for the community, the American community, to become somewhat healthier, we've got to make sure we figure a way back from a slippage toward a kind of Nietzschean skepticism and despair. Now, the second part of this initial page is just a listing of passages that I allude to in my remarks, and I won't read them except to say that I do think that, taken as a whole, they give support, if not proof, to some of the things that I give expression to. I think I might read for you the last one, taken from 1 Corinthians with a later allusion to Philippians, and then I'll start. And I'll read it fairly quickly. I want to be done in 15 or 20 minutes so that we have plenty of time for talk. Mind you, I haven't tried it. I hope I don't read more than 20 minutes. But here from 1 Corinthians 12. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. I take 1 Corinthians 12 to underscore the sense in which no one of us is really more important than any other. And surely no one category of us is more important than any other. Paul said in Philippians 2, do nothing from selfish ambition. I think this is a text any person with positional authority should read maybe daily. Do nothing from selfish ambition or empty conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Now, this is the essay. Just this little piece of background, I initially wanted it to be short. I'd written a series over a couple of years of very short pieces, but the more I thought about this, the more it ended up being sort of article length. And it's an effort by me. I mean, I've spent a long time in it, so I would win no prizes for speed writing. This thing has been kind of baking for hours and maybe days. But in a way, when I'm done with it, I feel discouraged because I think that the difference between especially leadership is conceived at the very top, and what perhaps I'm arguing for is quite a severe difference, and it requires us to imagine a world that can be changed fairly substantively. On the other hand, if I think about leadership from a Christian standpoint, and as you will see, I intend that concept to be meaningful, whether you're running the Sabbath school cradle roll or running the general conference. I think it does offer us a very healing sense of what it might be for us to be influencers. So if it's okay, I'm going to stop. I wrote it slowly. It's written, well, at the very end there, I say it's plausibly articulate. I'm trying to pretend to be humble, and we'll see how it goes. There'll be plenty of time for conversation. I'm looking at my watch, so I hope I can do it in about 15 minutes. I will not read slowly. Okay, I'll read fairly quickly. I stopped short when I read this from a Wendell Berry poem. Only the dead are changeless. In the margin, I wrote, why would anyone want to imitate them? Thoughtful church members brood over top church leaders who just stay put. When Mary Kay Silver asked years ago for pay equal to that of similarly situated men, men at the top initially said no, citing both religious and legal reasons. When overwhelming evidence showed that Ellen White's inspiration had been misrepresented, in fact, lied about, they sought, and many still do, to hide the truth. When it became clear that the earth is older than Bishop Ussher thought, headquarters double down. Now and forever, the evidence be damned. Behavior like this seems habitual, dangerous, sickening. Pressing God into a box and then making that box the last word is sheer arrogance and therefore, harsh as it is to say, sin. Yet it persists, repeatedly evident in effort by General Conference administrators to make all Adventist thought an exact echo of their own. Yet this can only freeze us into inflexibility, the condition of the dead, or the about to be dead. Any faith community that lasts adapts. Sorry, I went too far, didn't I? That's why many Adventists, and surely most young people, cannot think well of religious closed-mindedness. When the most influential administrators insist on it, they perpetuate a gospel-indifferent, morale-breaking leadership catastrophe. They destroy our future. And then I repeat that. Our topmost administrators don't even acknowledge, let alone confront, the possibility that they may be sort of destroying our community. They seem never to engage fresh, let alone critical perspective. When they complain about it, they don't bother with public good faith exchange of ideas. They see themselves above or even demeaned by conversation. But where Jesus is said to be Lord, such an attitude, though routine for totalitarians, is grotesque. The line between good and evil cuts through every human heart, so casting stones from an I know better viewpoint risks self-deception. The ice is thin for anyone doing what I am doing here. Still, when the high officials double down on staying put, Christian witness must sound the alarm. Whatever the hazard, we must declare whoever apes the dead by making no effort toward change or even toward good faith conversation not only offends God, but also hastens the end of Adventist Christianity. That this end may come slowly is no true comfort. What then is constructive Christian leadership? In all domains of church life, from Sabbath schools to worship services, from hospitals to schools to independent ministries, leaders matter. They persuade people, devise strategies, pull levers, make impressions. Anyone who affects outcomes, however modest or wide-reaching the sphere of influence, has leadership responsibility. Any such person embodies and symbolizes our life together as a church. In that light, then, I here single out three indispensable frames of mind for Adventist leaders, Adventist influencers today. I pass over traits like integrity, foresight, and financial competence that pertain to any leader. The following points address matters of piercing urgency among us right now. 1, expect change. This is my theme so far, and the Bible puts an exclamation point behind it. When in Exodus 3, Moses asks to hear God's name, a voice replies, Eya Asher Eya. In the translation we're used to, God says, I am who I am. Now, based on closer attention to Hebrew grammar, a widely favored translation is, I will be what I will be. In effect, God declares, I will always be ahead of you. Don't stop anywhere. Isaiah hears the same idea from the same God. I tell you new things, hidden things that you have not known. Hello, church, these passengers exclaim. Ruts, no. New roads, yes. When we overlook this, we are worshiping convention and assuring self-ruin. It is also true, of course, that talk like this feels scary. Does anything go? If everyone is taking new roads, what authority can prevent the collapse of Christian authenticity into careless fashion or sheer nuttiness? The answer takes us to the next indispensable frame of mind, to make Christ the center. For Christians, the resurrection was a declaration that Jesus Christ is Lord. The core ideal in the Hebrew Bible is chesed, or loving kindness. The core hope is shalom, or peace, human flourishing. The core attitude is humility, both joyful and grateful before God. Jesus took all these to heart. In attunement with the Christmas angels, he sought peace on earth. For him, this made forgiveness paramount, and love became a reaching out to all, enemies as well as friends. Although God had long spoken through human witnesses, Jesus alone, so Hebrews 1 said, was the exact imprint of divine life. What he did and said, the character he embodied, thus became the defining standard for Christian authenticity. In his light, Christianity is not so much a doctrine. Believe these propositions as a way of life. I can see that I meant that to be a new paragraph, and I just did it. In this light, Christianity is not so much a doctrine. Believe these propositions as a way or a way of life. But never, certainly, is it a matter of anything goes. It's about following Jesus. Still, this way, what first Christians call themselves, cannot be content with stasis. True faith looks to God's own Spirit, Jesus said, not only for strength, but also for deeper comprehension. The guidance comes to fruition, he said in Matthew 18, at precisely the point of good faith exchange. Remember, that's the discipline chapter in Matthew, where 2 or 3 sharers of the way engage in honest conversation. There, God in Christ is present, stretching the faithful to new places and new agreements. Again, ruts, no. New roads, yes. And on the journey, our conversation, what we're having right now or will be having, is how Christ remains the center. Spirit-led conversation, give and take that points beyond itself to the walk, not only the talk, is how grace embeds gospel truth into lives and institutions. And only thus embedded, thus rescued from mere wordiness into concrete reality, can Christian conviction make a difference. As aware persons all recognize, the world market for pious speech is fast declining. When Adventist leaders make our main mission a message, quote unquote, just getting information out, they entirely miss the point. Actual embodiment of the way of life Jesus announced is what matters. Anything less is irrelevance. A third leadership frame of mind, therefore, is essential. Build Christian communities. This effort must proceed by grace, by the sense again and again renewed of Christ as our center and his Spirit in and ahead of us as both support and guide. truly embraced, the third frame of mind says yes to possibility and hope. With equal urgency, it says no to self-preoccupation. Summoned into generous relationality, Christians enter spiritual families marked both by difference of need, background, and age, of station, education, and politics, and also, however imperfectly, by loyalty to Christ. We live in his light. And one implication is the sense that feelings of superiority, as by the better off, better placed, or better educated, can only make the good Lord cry and the angels laugh. A certain patience marks life together in Christ, not surrender, certainly, to ignorance and self-satisfaction, but the kindness and humility proper to our shared finitude and brokenness. As for administrative roles so often associated in Adventist life with high achievement, the imperative to build Christian communities strips them all of their justification, except as support for the twos or threes or more who share a thoughtful, caring Christian commitment together. Christian communities, congregations, are the embodiment of Christ. They are the only physical evidence of the resurrection. On them, every other expression of faithful conviction depends. Schools, hospitals, and ministries for kids, music groups, media initiatives, service projects, all these derive from something more basic than themselves. Their purposes, leaders, and support rise up from congregational soil. Either we or the wider world may ask what Christianity or Adventist Christianity is ultimately about, what it's really for. Church bureaucracies can give no convincing answer, nor any preacher or theologian. Only Christian life, tangibly shared, offers convincing display of Christian conviction. That is why preoccupation with baptismal statistics is misleading. Jesus did, to be sure, ask disciples to widen the circle of faithfulness. But when baptism does not entail sustained participation in a Christian community, it is an empty ritual. Why then are congregations so little upheld as the most important of all Christian institutions? Why, especially when they venture out of ruts, are they so little trusted? Why is so favored a place given to top-down orders and initiative? Why not wider acknowledgement that cookie-cutter standardization can only impede, not enhance? Congregations are where the Spirit typically does its work, giving strength, healing differences, helping us blaze new trails. They are the factor most likely determines whether, in our varied kinds of brokenness, we stay the Christian course or drop away. They determine, in short, whether Christian movements bear effective witness in the world. Now, this next bit is much shorter, and it's a good thing. Change is difficult as well as energizing. In obliterating complacency, Christ brings challenges as well as solace. Nor does anything here entail disdain for helping administrative units. For a large, in our case, international communion of congregations, administrative units are necessary to worldwide functioning and mission. The argument I am making does advance, however, one implacable, widely unacknowledged truth, which can be put in terms Skip Bell and his Andrews University colleagues once developed at book length. True leadership does not equate to positional authority. True leadership is relational. The pertinent relationships involve God and people alike and pull us into a shared, strenuous, and patient, reaching for goals. Such an activity, it goes without saying, can be no cakewalk. To say this another way, constructive Christian leadership is not so much being over as being with, not so much direction and control as assistance, inspiration, and example. Much discouragement attends the fact that our topmost leaders so often resist this. In our smaller domains of influence, all of us, of course, could do better. There is, after all, no perfection in relationships. I've made my case. Can I end now with hope? Perhaps not. My adult life matches the span of contemporary Christian controversy over the place of women in church life. When I attended the seminary at Andrews, the faculty was learned and forward-looking, ready, we all saw, to follow God out of ruts. Enthusiasm for Adventist ministry, moreover, was such that many of my classmates were children of highly educated Adventist professionals. But no one in classes I took was a woman, nor did I feel any lack because of this, or even really notice. I never heard a faculty member talk about it. Still, within 2 or 3 years of my 1968 graduation, Adventist women were voicing to considerable notice their hope of eventual welcome into Adventist ministry. Because I had great seminary teachers, the best of them tragically soon left or were eased out, I found it easy to begin identifying with these women's cause. The arguments for it were compelling in part for the pathos they evinced, but it was becoming clear, too, that theological obstacles to change, like church tradition, patriarchal influence in Scripture, can be surmounted. The Apostle Paul made affirming note of women in leadership roles and twice declared women and men equal. Jesus questioned conventional role distinctions as between women and men. He told the disciples, moreover, that the Holy Spirit would continue to ease them and us into new light, including difficult new light. These facts were convincing enough that long years later, even the now more conservative seminary went public in support of equality for women and men in ministry. Nevertheless, stay-put administrators at the top, by no means everywhere, resisted. They still resist, unmoved either by the pain women feel or by the evident trajectory of Scripture. Not even the fact that Scripture nowhere opposes the ordination of women has cracked the hard shell. And this has been tragic. For nearly 3 generations now, our church has been bleeding members, not least younger ones, over its mistreatment of women. A year or so after I became the pastor of the Sligo church in the mid-1980s, a young couple that both my predecessor, that would be Jim Londis, and I were close friends, and I considered hugely valuable lay leaders, told me they were departing Adventist Christianity. We can no longer belong to a church that has an official policy of discrimination, they said. It was heartbreaking. And I very well knew that they were two among many to come. To this day, though, resistance. To this day, official embrace of discrimination. What topmost administrators overlook, but pastors who deal in human reality, not just doctrinal abstraction, can hardly miss, is that those who leave over this are not coming back. Ever. If the church overcame its discrimination, or less delicately, its misogyny, some might return, but how many? And this does not address the reality that many of the upset keep their names on the church books, but hardly participate. Will the children of these non-participants one day enliven Sabbath schools, run Pathfinder clubs, lead out in congregational worship? I need not say. So again, now that I've made my case concerning leadership and noted all these exasperating difficulties, can I end with hope? Well, there is evidence for Adventist openness to change. Here and there, convention-breaking scholarship and congregational life testify to this. I could mention the One Project, Crosswalk, and of course, you'll see a reference indirectly even to Adventist Today in a minute. Here and there, so do initiatives in independent journalism, book publishing, filmmaking, service projects, and other lay-led ministries. Numerous women, moreover, have, despite opposition, found a way into pastoral ministry, and many administrators outside of headquarters continue to support them. Now, that sentence is a little misleading in that you'd find numerous people inside General Conference headquarters who privately support this. The trouble is that Adventist culture has granted immense symbolic sway to its top leadership. General Conference officialdom, along with quinquennial General Conference sessions, have come to stand for real Adventist Christianity, so that beliefs and policies affirmed in distant meeting places feel everywhere like who we really are, no matter the happenings elsewhere. That fact ensures that felt hope practically requires that truly constructive leadership instantiate itself, at least in small ways, at the very top. A start to this end would seem simple enough. A highly placed church officer or two, or thinkers at General Conference dominated institutions like the seminary at Andrew, the Adventist Review, or the Biblical Research Committee could chime in. They could engage in the give and take Jesus imagined. But whether from fear, pride, or indifference, they likely won't. I have offered, this is me in my self-referential mode, sorry. I have offered a specific and at least plausibly articulate challenge concerning leadership, but no one in these circles will say what I have missed or misstated or perhaps gotten right. And here, arguably, is the great catastrophe facing Adventist Christianity. Silver Spring's best known influencers, along with people directly beholden to them, shy away from or openly resist exchange of ideas, or at least such exchange when the topics address disagreement. They talk at us, not with us. One or more of them could disprove this. I hope for that every day. There you go. Now, my questions, I didn't write them out, but obviously I wonder what I have misstated or missed. And of course, I wonder if my characterization of the current situation is either too pessimistic or perhaps even too optimistic. It seems to me that we do have a major problem. And before I open up, I'll say that earlier this morning I heard a discussion of this survey of Adventist life that was sponsored by the General Conference. The same survey was administered to the members of the Zoom class that is situated in Sligo Church. And it amazed me to realize that so many members of the class are quite committed to their cultural life in Adventism, but a very high percentage of them are simply indifferent to our defining doctrines. Now, it struck me that alert leaders might infer from that we should perhaps put emphasis on the way of life, invite people into a redeeming culture, as opposed to insisting on doctrines that most people don't believe after the second or third generation. And most people who stay in the church anyway. So anyway, how do you all feel about leadership? Can you help me to understand it better or otherwise respond? I will be quiet. That took me more than 15 minutes, and I apologize.
You did great.
Shall I unshare so we can all see each other's?
Please do.
Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
You did well, Chuck. I think you presented the case well. I enjoyed immensely reading your presentations, and including the other part that you didn't read today, I believe. Lauren can't wait. Lauren, let us have it.
Yeah.
Both barrels.
Thank you. Chuck, I had already read this piece, of course, because I edited it for our website, and it was very good. I certainly like the idea that we should have servant leadership in the sense that you describe, talking with and not at. I will tell you what I think has happened. I think we've gotten so big, and we have so much at stake that the leaders that we have at the top feel like authoritarianism is the only way that they can manage it. I've told this to this class before, and I hate being the old guy who repeats himself, but I will say it again. When I first started with Adventist Today, I attended a lot of the General Conference Executive Committee meetings. I don't do that as much anymore. You would be shocked at the number of times that someone stands up on his hind legs and says, Ellen White says that we are God's highest authority on earth. It comes up over and over and over again. It is the foundation on which that group of people builds, Chuck. They say it repeatedly. They say it with such authority, and there is an intentional disconnect at that word of the General Conference in session. They just say the General Conference is God's highest authority on earth. And so that means the people standing at the microphone, the people voting things. And by the way, you all should know that the General Conference Executive Committee meets twice yearly, and it is made up almost entirely of people who work for the church and who work directly under Ted Wilson, including his closest staff, and all of those people are on the platform. So that idea of authoritarianism, it seems so, if you put it in terms, it seems like the church very strongly objected to Roman Catholicism, but they somehow did not object to Roman Catholics' sense of high authority at the very top. And they actually are proud of that and assert that over and over again, Chuck. It comes up, as I said, I've been at meetings where Ted would say it, and then Mark Finley would get up and say it, and it would happen over and over and over again. So that's my response to what you said there. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to push me to keep my answers short, or my responses short. They're not really answers. Yeah, I mean, it's depressing to think about this, because authoritarianism puts all of our it puts all the responsibility on a tiny little circle, and basically eliminates from conversation all of the other intelligent human beings who have needs and perhaps even ideas for how we can do better. As for the GC as the highest authority, now this point has been made, but unfortunately only in the kind of magazines that they won't read up there. But again and again, Adventist church historians have told that although you can find quotations to that effect in Ellen White, you can also find her explicit rejection of that idea.
Yes.
And it's as plain as it can be. From which we're to infer what? Well, we may infer that Ellen White does not give clear support to the idea that the GC is the, and of course, Scripture would be horrified by this. I don't know what it takes. I mean, once people get into the GC, there is this ethos in the church that making it to the GC is a mark of career success.
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of people up there probably get there and then they feel some disappointment in the experience. But there is nothing more destructive, here I am in my overstatement mode, to Adventist life than the thought that the mark of career success is a job in the GC. That the G, I mean, when I was living in DC, I had many friends and some church members still in the GC whom I loved, and I can name all kinds of them that I appreciate, but it's just misguided, self-deceptive, and pardon the exaggeration, demonic to suppose that administrative success is the essence of what it means to work in and for the church as ministers. That's just
right.
Insane. I don't know how to fight it, because they won't read and they won't discuss. Somebody up there should have a discussion. I don't know who the current expert on this. I'm sure that Gil Valentine would be. I remember I learned it from Bert Holoviak back in the days. It's as plain as it can be. She became frustrated with the funneling into a very small space of all Adventist in authority. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate that, but it
I've said,
underscores our problems.
I've said many times, Chuck, in order to be a success in Adventist ministry, you have to leave Adventist ministry and sit in an office.
Yeah.
It's the only way you can be counted as success. You can very rarely, there's one or two people, a Dwight Nelson perhaps, who stayed in pastoral ministry and was counted as success, but very rarely.
Yep, you're right. All you have to do is read the obituary page in the review, and there would be exceptions. I'm sure that when the day comes that Dwight passes away, he'll get an obituary in the review, but generally obituaries go to administrators.
Exactly.
Forrest Alexander, another response, perhaps?
Well, thank you, Chuck, for that exposition that you gave us just now. I appreciate some of the statements you made. For example, where it says true leadership is not positional but relational. I am wondering if the crux of the problem that we see in so many different symptoms in our church organization doesn't arise from ignoring what Jesus himself said about leadership. For example, in Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 and 26, it says, Jesus called them together, meaning his disciples, and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant." Jesus made a clear distinction between rulership or leadership over and leadership among. For example, the two different approaches to leadership generate very different dynamics. For example, leadership over has the leader viewed as different or perhaps even superior, whereas leadership among shows the leader as like us, one of us. Leadership through power is derived from hierarchy in leadership over, but leadership among is leadership that leads by example and by personal influence. There's a big difference. Communication in leadership over is from the top down, whereas leadership among is two ways, from the bottom up and from the top down. Decisions are made by the leader when you have leadership over, whereas leadership among, decisions are arrived at by consensus. That's a very different experience. And finally, I think one of the greatest distinctions between leadership over and leadership among is that leadership over exercises leadership through the love of power, whereas leadership among is leadership motivated by the power of love. So there's a big difference between the leadership over and among. And I'm wondering, do you think there was ever a time in the Adventist church when we had this kind of leadership among, the servant leadership that Lauren just referred to earlier? Was there ever a time when we had that kind of leadership in our church? And the next question that I follow up with that is that style of leadership still viable in our modern world?
Okay, I want to first of all say amen. Of course, I love that passage from Matthew 20. I think it's got parallels, in the one or two of the other synoptic gospels. It is so beautiful. It moves me to hear you read it. And I can only say amen to what you're saying right now, Horace. You asked me about, has there ever been a time? And I don't know the answer, although I generally have myself quite positive feelings about Jan Paulsen's leadership. You remember that he, just to take an example, had occasional listening sessions with younger Adventists. And now he didn't push himself on the church. I expect he is committed, he is favorable to the ordination of women. He was a listener on that regard. And some people fault him for not pushing that idea while he was in office. I don't know more than that because I don't know the past leaders. I think there's quite a bit of positive feeling about some of elder figures' leadership period, and I simply don't know earlier, to be honest. Can servant leadership play a role in today's big world? Well, obviously, it gets complicated. I mean, I've had small fry administrative roles. I had an experience once of letting 17 people go in a single day. So I know that it can get hair-raising, and that there is no way that a leader can simply avoid occasional really difficult decisions. But I think that if you define servant leadership in terms of its basic substance, that it is viable today, and that there are people. But I would also say this, that we ought to keep in mind that leadership within the church has its own rules and ideals. So it's not necessarily the case that I have to defend the church's ideals of leadership for whoever is running Boeing company, or whoever is the chief military officer in any nation. In the church, servant leadership is a mandate, and there have been leaders over time who have really done good work in that regard. I think of Martin Luther King, very flawed, but I just read a biography of him by Jonathan Ive. It was a recent one, and he was he was flawed, but he was also amazing. And he got so much done without just lording it over people.
Mhm.
And I'm sure there are other examples like that. So I think we ought to play up the examples and then do our best to renew our acquaintance regularly with the biblical ideal, which you've just helped us to do by bringing those great passages to our attention again. Thank you very much, Horace.
Well done.
I have some hands, so
Yep.
yeah, you're playing referee. Great, Gerald.
You bet. Anne, you're up. What have you got on your mind?
I think that our theology tends to lead us as a theology of the remnant, the chosen, leads us to poor leadership. I work in an interdenominational chapel that also engages interfaith dialogue. And I don't see any of that kind of problem that we see, and I say this with some regret, but with some of the leaders that we currently have in the GC, that we have to realize that God is much bigger than our denomination. And as long as we insist that we have the truth rather than the truth has us, we don't have problems with leadership.
I simply agree. But I mean, another thing that is so fundamentally mistaken and yet so deeply ingrained in church life is that somehow or other, and by the way, this isn't just an Adventist problem. I've been studying just lately the period in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries when early Christians were fighting over how to understand the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And it was an ugly battle and disgusting. And it underscored the fact that some of the leaders of the church in those days, influenced as they were by the Greeks, came to think of correct belief as the point. One leader, which pope was it? It wasn't Pope Leo, because he was, but anyway, one leader insisted in an official statement that giving in to the correct version of a particular take on Christ's nature that he represented would be necessary to be saved. Well, you don't find you don't find that as an emphasis in the New Testament. The New Testament preaching is an invitation into a culture created by grace. And there are beliefs. There is a commitment to the centrality of Christ, but there is not what I think of as a doctrinal fussiness over the minutest little detail in the interpretation of Scripture. The point of doctrine is that doctrine provides us with the basic convictions that undergird a way of life. So I think you're right. The notion that the remnant are people who have the truth is deeply mistaken. And one of the mistakes is that it makes it hard for our leaders to acknowledge the importance of conversing with people not themselves, including people who are not Adventist. We can learn from many different places, including, of course, non-Christian places. Thank you, Ann.
And thank you. I think that properly places some of the onus in this dilemma back on each one of us. Thank you so much for that.
Chuck, I was going to inject here. You may not remember this bit of history. You weren't around, and neither was I. You're old, but not old enough to remember that Arminius, after he was voted down by the Council of Nicaea, somebody poisoned him.
Oh, yeah.
And,
The book to read here, if you want to be discouraged, is by Philip Jenkins. It's called The Jesus Wars. And maybe it's not healthy, but he just puts a lot of attention on the violence. There was horrendous violence against people deemed heretical. I mean, of the worst kind, of the kind we now somewhat unfairly associate with radical Islam. It happened right in the beginning, in those first several centuries. Thank you very much.
There was and remains a great deal at stake. Bjorn, help share.
Thank you. For those that have joined since my early comments at the start of the Zoom session, I'll do my quick commercial real quick. I'm at 190 miles of the 230, so on the outskirts of Paris. So thank you everyone for the amazing support. It's been amazing, and I'll repost my sponsorship link. That's the commercial, and thank you again. So question here, I was interested when I went to church today. I often, when I travel, I try to sound out how people feel about the GC or about Ted Wilson in a way that doesn't necessarily bias them either way. I just want to know. So when I was at Sabbath lunch, when I got spontaneously invited, somehow the conversation shifted to church leadership. And I remember asking my host, so what do you think about Ted? And he looked at me, and this is a 50-year-old, very active Adventist, been in a church quartet, everything. He just said, Ted who? Or he's like, Ted Key? And I was like, Ted Key? I was like, Ted Wilson. And he was just blank, didn't know. And I told him, oh, well, I mean, he's the president of the General Conference. And I asked the wider group, what do you think of, his work, his leadership? And they couldn't tell me. The best thing is someone knew that he spoke good French. I think a couple of them were like, oh, he speaks pretty good French. He must have worked in Haiti. I was like, I think it was Africa. That was about the extent of it. So that kind of brought, the idea of it's the GC and that kind of leadership is so far removed from the Western parts of the world. Congregations here, there's basically no interface. It's absolutely, kind of detached from, I would say, Western European, North American, Australian, et cetera, reality. Where it does matter more is actually where, and this might run counter to what we're saying here, but is actually where it works. So, when I've lived in Asia and I've asked the same questions, there's deep admiration for this style of leadership. There's great support for it. There are words of praise. And, so I'm torn. I'm like, well, what do I say to that? I mean, do I criticize it when it seems to be working in this part of the world and where that is how you lead? Or, do I don't know. Yeah. What do I do, responsibly? So I guess my question is, what can we do in this given situation? And so my style is basically just to do as much as I can to help the local congregation, to be an active part of local congregations, to strengthen that side of Adventism, and to influence the general narrative, but not really worry about the GC. What do you think about that kind of an approach? Is it too cavalier? Is it too irresponsible? And yeah, what do you think about these different geographical realities when it comes to church leadership?
Well, of course, I think about them, you know, more than I know. I've been around. I have a kid who lived in France for 10 years, and I used to visit Nice. I visited the church in Nice, but I didn't ask these questions. I suspect there's a connection between French society and this attitude. You know, it's a society committed to what do they call it? Laïcité. I mean, this radical secularism.
Yeah, it's pronounced.
It's not an authoritarian society. The official society is quite antagonistic to much of Catholic authoritarianism, although I think there's still a strong Catholic presence. I don't have all the answers, but I do think that what you're talking about is fine and good. Namely, let's support local I use the word community because I would assume that this Sabbath school class is a community and that the leadership of this class is doing something that's important. It might be that the definition of congregation needs to be somewhat widened out. I think that in older Adventism, I think we still have a big problem with the GC having the kind of authority it has. Less so, though, in Europe because they've been willing to resist. But even in Europe, it's a problem because even in Europe, what was the most recent one was a pastor, I think, who wasn't particularly in a LGBTQ type relationship, but
he was bi. He came out as bi.
He was bisexual. He publicly said he was bisexual, and I think that there was support in Germany, but there was an eventual decision by him to retire, as I remember, because it's not as welcome as it could be. So we still have major problems, and I don't think the problems will ever go away. I don't mean here to suggest that if you read my essay and tried to live by it, that everything would be hunky-dory. The fact is that communities of all kinds are fragile. Communities require patience. Communities require a willingness for a certain kind of compromise, and it isn't easy. But I'm entirely with you, Bjorn, in that I think we should be putting our energy into congregations. It's hard to do, and post-COVID, it's harder than it ever was. Plus, we're dealing now not just with difficulties inside of our church, but we're dealing with rising hostilities to Christianity in the wider culture, and those hostilities are in part a function of the culture's mistaken leap into a kind of radical secularism, but they are substantially a result of Christian hypocrisy. And my claim would be that Christian hypocrisy is partly driven by preoccupation with doctrine. We have to be preoccupied with helping each other be the disciples of Christ. That's where the energy needs to go. And
Thank you. Thank you both. Bjorn. Robert Johnston, I can depend on you bringing us back to a solid core. Lead us on.
I'm not sure about that, but thank you. And I want to say that I resonate a great deal with what Chuck has presented. Two things. The idea of a monarchical episcopate began with, or at least was first promoted by Ignatius of Antioch early in the 2nd century. And within about a century later, you have the concepts of orthodoxy and heterodoxy coming up. These were responses to the fact that there were people calling themselves Christians who were an embarrassment. For example, libertine Gnostics and such. It was a response to that and to schism. So my first question is, how do you deal with schism and people who call themselves Christians or Adventists who are an embarrassment? Early Adventism had a lot of those. Ellen White called them fanatics.
Mhm.
And I suspect that the impulse to have strong leadership was largely a response to that. That's my first question. The second is I really like your call for an exchange of ideas for people of different orientations, call them liberal and conservative or whatever you call them, to converse with each other. That's a two-way street. Progressives need to invite conservatives to a forum where you can both talk in a sustained way. When the Adventist forums were first organized, I think back in the back in the 60s, wasn't it? I think it was in the 60s. I think they invited General Conference people to meet with them, and the General Conference declined to do so, which was a terrible blunder, in my view. Terrible blunder. But it's a two-way street. We want them to talk to us, but we want to talk to them actually, but we should listen to them talk to us. And for a real dialogue to take place, there has to be a forum where that can happen. And no such forum now exists, as far as I know. Those are my two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I saw your son this morning in an earlier Zoom class, by the way, who is a wonderful guy. Your point about schism is well taken, and they were really nutty people. I mean, you know far more history than I know, but having just read Jenkins's book, I've got a less than vague sense of it, I think now. I think that schisms are hard, and you will recall that in my piece I allow for the need for administrative units. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made, but I think one can agree to that without lapsing into violence, the way some of the officials in the church began to do, I think later than Ignatius, I'm not sure, but I mean, into the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, they lapsed into violence. They lapsed into even a person like Augustine, a very revered father of the church, was willing to use forced conversion if necessary to deal with some problems. And there are limits, and I think that a community committed to the sort of nonviolent peacemaking, as it were, of the Sermon on the Mount will be very careful to do as little in the way of force as possible, but it has to be done. I am not claiming here that administration is easy, and I am not claiming that administrative units are irrelevant, because they are pertinent. Now, as for the schism issue, how do you stop it? There are some kinds of schisms that simply can't be stopped by decent conversation and care. I think we ought to put a lot of energy into inviting schismatics over to lunch. That sort of builds on what you say in the second part of your remark, but it can be difficult. And so I'm not arguing for, as it were, antiseptically pure servant leadership that never lifts a finger in the way of pushing toward solutions. Now, as for the exchange of ideals, I think you're right, and I have personally made some efforts, but I don't think, for example, that I have ever communicated with Elder Wilson, except when we were both young. I actually I knew him when he was a CUC student, and we had a weekend project we worked on together, I remember very well. And I also wrote an article about him when I was at Insight Magazine. I went to New York City, interviewed him and all of that. But I don't think it can be said that I've tried to touch base with him. I have tried to touch base once in a while. I've encouraged the current dean of the seminary to have public conversation about our belief on Scripture as set forth in the fundamental beliefs makes no reference to Christ, and no reference to what I take to be the most important hermeneutical passage in Scripture, which is Hebrews 1:1-3. I've encouraged him to figure out a way to have public exchange of opinion on that. on a Sabbath afternoon or maybe a couple of day conference. But I think it's regarded, now you would know better than I know you're retired now, but you know the seminary better than I. I think it's regarded as territory best left, as it were, untilled, due to the fact that the top leadership of the GC has a very, very high commitment to understanding Scripture in such a way that you don't have to acknowledge Hebrews 1:1-3. That is to say, understanding Scripture more or less fundamentalistically. So I think it's a challenge, but you're right. Progressive types, as along with the conservatives, we need to be taking meals together, and we need to be exchanging ideas. And what we could do, I mean, I'm way past, I'm like you, I'm way past retirement, but I agree with your point. Absolutely. And I appreciate your expressing it for us again.
You're bringing back to that point you made, Chuck, which is this is all relational. Really is. Linda nodding. We mutually admire one another. I love you, sister. What have you got on your mind in response to this challenging little mess we've gotten us into?
Well, it was my intention to be silent today, but Lauren goaded me into raising the issue, which I will do. And Chuck, I very much appreciated your presentation. I actually have read both of the essays and concur with everything you had to say. The only thing I wanted to point out is that although you did it in sort of a tangential way, I've heard a number of others in recent times always offer up the idea that, you know, no matter how ridiculous they are at the General Conference, we always have the local congregation. Like that's the great panacea. Mm-hmm. I always get the sense that the people I see who, or I hear who say that, all probably belong to big churches like Loma Linda University or La Sierra, or, you know, churches associated with hospitals and medical centers and that sort of thing. Because in my experience, and I belong to a small church today, but let me tell you my perception of a small church. First of all, you may get an old deadbeat guy for the pastor who's counting his days to retirement, but more likely you're going to get some upstart that's right out of seminary who is an administrative idiot, who would be unable to manage their way out of a paper bag. But the one thing they all seemed highly skilled at is right away constructing a groupthink church board that will rubber stamp any idiotic idea that they have. And they all seem to be categorically unconnected to the members, the demographics and the needs and whatnot. And I could give you some examples, but you probably don't need those. But I just want to say that if that's what everybody's hanging on, and Lauren talks about this, about 90% of the churches in this country are little and they're all dying. But if somehow this mystical notion of the local congregation is going to be our saving grace, in the face of a stultified and fossilized General Conference, I got to tell you, I think we're the band playing on the Titanic, because I don't see it. I'm not seeing it. I have belonged to big churches, and I long today to hear a good organ being played and see capable programs. One of the last churches that I belonged to, because I live in Florida, and there are several small churches here, and I have belonged to two of them in the course of time. But I just have found that they, it's really unfortunate. They just don't have any sense of what the church needs or how to go about getting it. And but they all move on. All these young men, they move on. They get put up into conference positions. And so there we are, stuck with the remains, the leftovers, the ineffectual programs. And then this next to the last one that I belonged to, when I was a new member, I said to one of the longtime members, I said, are there outreach programs here at this church? He says, oh yeah, we have a lot. I said, well, what are they? What are some? Because I was contemplating volunteering, and he couldn't think of any. And that's because there weren't any. Okay. Yeah. Well, they had one. They had Vacation Bible School. That was the only thing. There was nothing else that was outreach. So what do you say to those of us who are, because of where we live, are stuck in these local congregations that are petty, that I put in the chat, they're judgmental, they're petty, they're backbiting, they're cliquey. And in fact, when actually before the pandemic, when the church that I belong to today decided they would get rid of all the adult Sabbath school classes. And oddly enough, in this church, there were probably 6 or 8 thriving adult Sabbath school classes where people could come together and have their praises and their prayer requests and study the Bible. They got rid of all of those so they could live stream. And all of us old people were just really sorry and begged the pastor, please, nope, can't do that. This is this young upstart's new idea. So what do we do? I mean, if that's our last hope, then we're doomed.
Well, let me say a couple of things. One is that the wider society is not supporting Christianity. So, for example, this very week, I was reading my book. I'm a caregiver. I have my wife is under hospice care. She's right beside me right now. And I do have paid help certain number of hours most days, a few hours most days. So I was at a coffee shop and weirdly enough, I was reading this book, The Jesus Wars by Philip Jenkins, although the cover wasn't open. And an older woman, I think older women are attracted to me because I'm older. She stops me. That was a joke. I mean, she says to me, "What are you reading?" And it turned out she was kind of bookish. She subscribed to the New Yorker magazine, and she was immediately interested. And it became immediately clear that she was Methodist. And then she told me that last Sunday in her Methodist church, they had a feature for kids, and there was one kid who came to the front. So congregations are struggling everywhere. We've got a society that has turned an eye of either indifference or hostility on the Christian church for the reasons I discussed before. Now, getting back to the other issue, part of it, of course, is that these younger people who get pushed up to a conference office are still under the conviction that is what counts as success in Adventist ministry. But here, and Bob has already chimed in, but I'm going to still venture a slight criticism of the seminary, which would have been true. Was true of the period when I was there, when I really loved the faculty. By the way, Bob is one of the best. I've never had him as a teacher, but I've had him as a colleague in meetings where he presents papers, and he's fabulous. But I'm trained as a theologian, which might make you think that all I want to do is study theory. But I think that the job in the seminary, the job is to both train and motivate pastors of congregations. And that virtually, this is doubtless overstatement, that virtually any class taught in the seminary should be taught in such a way that the students get a sense of its connection with being a pastor in a small Florida congregation. So if someone taught, I took New Testament theology from a guy named James Cox, and he was brilliant, but what he didn't do, I don't think, was to actually address by way of an occasional aside, or maybe even a capstone class day, say, from my study, the core concerns of the New Testament can assist local congregations this way or that way. We've got to create enthusiasm for local congregations. I'm not really resolving the problems you bring up, but I think seminary focus, official church leader focus, combined with interests of the kind you represent, Linda, could over time generate some sort of congregational renewal. But it's hard. It's very hard. And I hate to give it.
Bear in mind one more thing, which we haven't even said, is that the local congregation is the economic foundation of our church's elementary parochial system. Okay.
True.
So to the extent that further erodes, the effect of that is going to have a significant detrimental influence on our ability to maintain Adventist elementary schools.
And academies and colleges. They all rise up from congregational soil. It's so obvious to me, not that it has been my whole life, but I've spent my life trying to get clearer about it. And you're right. There's nothing, everything else is footnotes. Everything else is footnotes.
Yes,
Thank
indeed.
you so much, Linda.
And
Thank you.
Linda, thank you for all that you do and continuing to be a leader in your local church. I think it's magnificent that some of our congregation here at Adventist today.
No, I'm not there,
Still-
Jerry. Jerry, my church is my Zoom group. That's it. I haven't
You don't
darkened.
teach Sabbath school anymore?
I do on Zoom. I
There
have
you-
not darkened the door of my church since before the pandemic.
Well, thank you for that ministry. Keep it.
Sorry.
The Stovall household. You've got a group there. Tell us what's on your mind today. Give us a synopsis of your group thing.
A couple of things. One is just a tongue in cheek for Lauren. When it was talked about bringing conservative and progressive together, I would say, Lauren, you should do a personal invite to Fulcrum 7. Anybody that knows anything about Fulcrum 7 knows where that would go. The other thing that was brought up when you were talking about people asking what the purpose of the church is. Just yesterday, I had gotten in my email a link through the Adventist Review, and it was a talk with TW celebrating the 150 years of the mission of the church. The first thing he said, the very first thing emphasized, Christ is coming soon. We've got to finish the work. Then for the next 5-10 minutes, it was all about his version of what the gospel was and what our mission as a church was. We got to convert this other 30, 80 billion people in the world so that God can come. He reiterated over and over. That's why the Adventist church was here. We are the remnant people. We must get out there and let other people know about all of this. So when you talk about change or of attitudes or anything, I don't think there's a person here that will be alive to see any change. Now, that doesn't mean we can't keep trying, but it isn't going to happen. Not when your leadership is so far focused in other directions. Nothing in his talk that I listened to, and I only listened to it for 10 or 15 minutes, mentioned how we approach others, our responsibility to others, and how we do our ordinary lives. It was all about getting out there and telling the world how screwed up it was, and we had the answer. So I'm glad to hear these talks and hear these solutions because they're fantastic. But unless they're wide or disseminated, and I don't know how that can be done, you're essentially speaking to the choir here. And that's not bad. But somehow your message and other people who bring up topics like you got to get the message outside of the choir. End remarks.
Well, thank you. And of course, he exemplifies the idea that the mission of the church is get information out, and that has all kinds of implications. For one thing, Elder Falkenberg was well known. I don't think this is a slur. I think this is a fact. He was very cynical about the importance of nurture, because sometimes reforming minded Adventists will say, well, we have to nurture disciples. And he said, no, that's a distraction, essentially. The point is to get the word out. Well, there is nothing more misguided and self-deceptive than that. And the reason is that there's a declining world market for words, pious words, and that our call is precisely to be the body of Christ, not to talk about being the body of Christ, to be it. That's how people change and how we, when we're lucky, maintain our commitment, whatever our form of brokenness. And of course, the brokenness is always likely to be more sharply felt as you age. And I'm aging, and I need support of Christian communities. We all do. Ted is simply completely self-deceived. It's a shame. I mean, it makes me ill to say it, but it's true.
Well,
Thank you
apparently
very
it's
much.
But thank you. David, I cherish reading your chat bots. Interesting stuff coming through. So what are you willing to share with the rest of us verbally and in person?
Yeah, thanks. And lots of things I'm thinking about, but I appreciate this last bit about information versus relationship. That was where I started coming into this presentation, having read your essay on A today, is that, yeah, to me, that is the point, is being together. It's something we do. It's not just telling a bunch of people, well, this is some ideas we have. What really got me thinking and listening to you is when you read, to say this another way, constructive Christian leadership is not so much about being over as being with, not so much direction and control as assistance, inspiration, and example. And it made me wonder if part of this is profoundly theological. That, and I've noticed this for a while, that in Adventism, I think this is a reflection of larger Christianity, we have a really, really strong emphasis on divine sovereignty. God is in control. And this gets into providence as well. You know, whatever happens is God's will. And I mentioned there, you know, so many people get into leadership. Well, it must be because God chose me, because that's the only way good things happen, is because God made them happen. But it also gives us the aspect that to be like God is to be in control. To be like God is to act without anybody saying otherwise. And it seems to me like this is part of where we need to start our response. And it's crazy as Adventists, because we're like, the core of the great controversy, the core of our understanding of the Bible is that God does not act like that. And yet this focus on sovereignty gets smuggled in. And it seems to me that shapes a huge amount of the way we do church and Christianity. So I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I tend to think that you said something insightful right now. I mean, if you embrace a notion of sovereignty that involves complete control, and of course, there's no phrase more commonplace, hardly any phrase more commonplace in popular Christianity than God is in control. It's odd in a way, since Jesus is God in the flesh, God's human face. And if there's anything Jesus was not, it is in control. He ended up crucified, a shameful, shameful death that was disgusting to everybody. So I think you're onto something. If we interpret divine sovereignty as control over, then we will, if we start cultivating a frame of mind like this, I must be an imitator of God. If you're going to be an imitator of God who is in control, you're going to have tendencies toward a controlling account of Christian influence. So I think you've said something very insightful there. But the problem is not that God is controlling, but what does that mean for us? It's that God is not in control in an authoritarian sense.
Yeah.
That's just a fact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate that. And many of your other thoughts. We'll get to some more of those, I think, in the next 5 minutes or so. Lauren, you've come up with a new thought. Please share with us.
Yeah, I wanted to answer Dr. Johnson a little bit, where he said the progressives need to invite others into conversation, and just tell you a little bit of my experience with this. I'll go back to one of the first executive committee meetings that Bjorn and I attended. and Bjorn could probably speak for himself on this. He said, I'd like to, he walked up to Elder Wilson because he had known Elder Wilson's children and said, I'd like to ask you about every member involvement. And we could write a little piece about it in Adventist Today. And he was as cold as could possibly be. He said, I will not talk to you whatsoever if you're working for Adventist Today. We invited Bill Knott to come and teach, and he did a very nice job, and fielded some hard questions. And he got called in and scolded, and I've contacted him since, and he said, no, I can't talk to you anymore. One of the best events we ever had in Adventist Day Sabbath Seminar was a teaching by Daniel Duda, who's the president of the TED, what's that stand for? Trans-European Division. Really fantastic. I mean, so good that people, I remember several people wrote and said, this is probably one of the most moving and helpful things I've ever done. He wrote me a couple days later and said, could you please not post the recording? I got called in on the carpet and scolded because I had talked with you. I invited the communications director of the General Conference, a young man named Sam Nevis, and he called me on Friday and said, I can't talk to you. I've been called in and told that I cannot talk to you whatsoever. We've tried really hard to make contact with a lot of people and invite them. And now I know that sometimes we have pieces that are a little bit strong. I understand that, but I would welcome someone to speak for the other side. Ironically, the only person that ever did that in a very controlled and nice way was my old friend Marvin Moore before he died. He did a beautiful job coming back and responding. But Chuck and Bob, I've really tried. I've given my best to invite these people in and let them say whatever they want to say. And over and over again, we have been thwarted. And when we do get responses, let's say comments and so forth, from people on Adventist Today, it's generally without any nuance. My favorite name that I've been called is the Scion of Satan, and I've been called that so many times. I think I'm going to grow horns and a pointy tail, because we cannot get anybody to, in a nice way, present their side of the story. I'd welcome that, Chuck. I'm wide open to apologetics that would present it in a nice way. I just can't get it, and we have tried. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, well, I chaired the board of the Adventist Forum and Spectrum for a while, and I was constantly expressing an attitude similar to what I expressed at the very end of these written remarks, namely that I would love to see someone respond. But people in institutions that are under the control of the GC, they are afraid. I am a neighbor, more or less, half of every year, I'm a neighbor to someone who taught at the seminary for 19 years. And he tells me that the place is cloaked in an atmosphere of fear. A certain amount of fear all the time is what he experienced when he was there. Now, he also experienced, and I'm sure by the way, I have high respect for him, but he experienced effort by seminarians to do the best they can in these circumstances. But top leadership in the whole habit of Adventist leadership has been, to a very unfortunate degree, shaped by authoritarianism. And we know what authoritarians do when challenged intellectually. They ignore it. That's what you do. You ignore it. You ignore opposition or ignore critique. That's the totalitarian way. It's a shame. There are good people, but the system is stuck.
Thank you.
I had the Myers from Oregon disappeared from my screen. Can you unmute? Go ahead, Doug.
Yes, I am unmuted.
Good. Thank you so
Yes.
much. You don't know, but I used to live in Forest Grove for many, many years. Grew up around the Portland area, and I miss that area. Thank you.
Excellent. And I remember Chuck's push button transmission Chrysler when I was a youngster, and he took me to Camp Myvedon.
Good night. I completely forgot I ever had a push button. Oh my goodness.
Anyway, that wasn't really the point. I resonate with several of the comments made, and hopefully this isn't too many, but I resonate with the Ted Who. There's a certain level of historic anarchy that I think is healthy. Was reading recently a book that I thought was pretty heretical by its title, but was incredibly helpful, though it's not Adventist. Peter Enns' Sin of Certainty. And as I read it, I started to understand what one of the other commenters had addressed. I think it's basic humanity where we want to have certainty. Of course, probably when I was a youngster, that was helpful. But now I'm much older, and I do understand why people want God in charge. And I do think that's a better way of saying it than God in control. The pastors may be in charge of the church, although maybe that's not an ideal example, but he certainly isn't in control in a good church. But I think Adventism, as has been expressed earlier by one of the other commenters, we have this desire to have everything nailed down. And we want to convince others that we have everything nailed down. And as I'm slowly giving up that need to have everything nailed down, I think I am being much better off than having that sin of certainty. And I may not like the word sin, but it's certainly a craving, a human craving. And so I think that's one of the things that has helped me along that path. I also agree with Bjorn. Culture does matter. I get that. I taught Japan Airlines pilots for a number of years. Their culture is different. And I also resonate with one of the leaders in the social justice movement who said, we're on a 500-year clock for change. I agree with her. If that's true, we're not even past halfway point. It's going to be several generations. I also resonate with Paul in this respect. Paul had some real falling out with others that accompanied him. And as I recall, Ellen White made the statement that it was just fine for them to part company because they did better going their separate ways than they did together. And I think of Czechoslovakia, a amicable parting ways between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And I don't think schism has to be a bad thing. In fact, if I can use this analogy, which probably only works here, I love the rainbow. If the rainbow is beautiful all the way from red to purple, and maybe the colors we can't see, then I'm okay. Unlike most Adventists, where we see all of these other Protestants as, well, we use disparaging words, but I love the spectrum that can come, pardon the pun, from having all of these different ideas and still being affectionate in our belief for each other and in our relationships, which is part of what you said, and still being very different. And so I think in the end, I'm going to suggest something that I heard. I didn't make it up. Hope is a discipline, not a feeling.
That was hope, right?
Hope is a
Yeah, I got it.
discipline. Yeah.
Agreed, Chuck?
Oh, yeah, I agreed. I figured we needed to move quickly, but I actually quite love. Now, I have in my head had a version of that same thing in mind, Doug, namely that hope is a virtue. Yeah, it's very much different from optimism. Optimism is an evaluation of what's going on. Hope is a determination to affect what's going on, and a conviction that somehow the energy you put into this is not wasted.
Good. Thank you for that clarification. And Doug, thank you for bringing that up. Robert, we've been talking about you. You've heard it. What's your response?
You mean me?
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate what Lauren said about his thwarted attempts to initiate dialogue. It sounds like the same thing that happened when the Adventist Forums were first being founded. I think there are people in administration who would like to do this. I understand the fear. I think those of you who are able to invite people like that to lunch, see if you can figure out a way in which we could set up a neutral territory. It might be hard to invite conservatives to appear in a progressive Sabbath school like this one, and I'm not sure whether comparable conservative forum would ever even think of inviting a progressive. What we need is a neutral no man's land where both sides can meet without stigma. Now, we have two scholarly societies, the Adventist Society for Religious Studies, which is sort of broad church, maybe a little on the progressive side, and is the larger of the two societies. The other is the Adventist Theological Society, which is the more conservative one. And quite a number of people are members of both. The trouble is they're academics, and academics are more vulnerable than anybody. We need to get some people of influence, maybe people like Dwight Nelson, or maybe some closet conservatives or middle of the road people who are in the general conference. If we can identify such people and persuade them to start something new, to start a place that is neutral, where all kinds of opinions can be presented without fear. It doesn't exist now. The idea of letting schism take its course is, of course, something that's happened in church history many, many times. And the Christian Reformed Church broke out of the Reformed Church of America because it thought that the parent organization, the larger organization, was not conservative enough. And that kind of thing has happened lots of times. I even think the Worldwide Church of God might have originally split off from Advent. This is nothing new, but I think it represents a defeat. I think we have to somehow demonstrate that people can talk together. And when two opposing views finally separate and a wall is built up between them, they can no longer teach each other. I think we need a forum where they can learn from each other. And I don't think an encouraged schism would promote that.
Well, I appreciate what you just said, Bob. And I know we have other hands, and I don't know your time frame, but somebody's going to cut us off pretty soon. So I'll not say more except thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Chuck, for your ease of mind, we have until actually 3 o'clock our time. So that's
Okay.
simple. James Londas, I don't hear you every day on this, but I cherish what you have to say. Share.
Well, Chuck, Chuck and I are very close friends. See each other regularly, so not I'm not ignorant of his passions, and I support them totally. Let me say two things from my own experience that I think may be clarifying. I have been in conversations in the past when I was at Sligo prior to Chuck's tenure with General Conference leaders who were members of the church. And a certain kind of syllogism emerges when you are in the leadership of the General Conference. A, the most important message on the face of the earth at present is from the Seventh-day Adventist community. And secondly, God wants that community to succeed in a way that prepares a people for the second coming. Therefore, the person who is in charge of that community is the most important person on earth. From that syllogism comes a desperate need for leadership to not fail, because God's depending on me. It all depends on us or on me. And when the General Conference president really thinks that Jesus' coming may be dependent on his performance or hers, dream on, performance, and that Jesus at the second coming will be unhappy with the General Conference president if he is not presenting the people of God to him, who can sustain that kind of psychological pressure? It means that leadership has collapsed into a kind of almost authoritarian, but not authoritarian even in a healthy sense, almost a Hitler-like need to control everything, because if I fail, everything is lost. And I'm sympathetic with that kind of concern. And many of the General Conference presidents, I'm not going to name them because I've known at least 8 or 10, are deeply spiritual people in many respects. They care profoundly about this church and they worry about it. And they are afraid at times to listen to any voice that says, maybe there's something else you should be thinking about. And that, I don't know how we break through that. I don't know how we break through that. And it may be that, as you know, schism is one wake-up call, but I'm not sure it is. But another one, here's the one I'm going to throw out at you, because Chuck and I have been through one of these. Invite a General Conference president to a small group in complete confidence for a long weekend, 8 or 10 other people, 12 people, whatever, and make it clear that that meeting is off the record and will never be publicized, never be betrayed. And just say, we want to sit with you, eat with you, pray with you, talk with you about all kinds of things. We have agenda items. We want you to present agenda items and see what happens at the end of that weekend. He has to feel safe that he can be honest, and you have to feel safe that being honest with him is not going to have a detrimental impact on your life or your career. It's possible. It's not easy. Chuck and I went through a weekend like that years ago, and it was remarkable. It was marvelous, and it was good for all of us. And that is a bold way to, I think, ask leadership to trust us and be sure that they are not betrayed. They will not come if they think they can't be kept in confidence.
Thank you, Jim. We both remember that weekend. It was made possible in part by someone, not either Jim or I, but it worked out to be an example of Christian brotherhood that we will always remember.
It's perhaps an ideal, but I would cherish such an opportunity, and I think it would grow fruit. Eduardo, thank you for being here and for your patience. How has this impacted you, and how can you share with us?
Chuck, I'm glad to see you again.
Yes, we go back. We go back to Loma Linda, but we see each other every week.
You're a nice guy. Chuck, one time Elder Wilson told me Eduardo, you stopped God's money being invested in weapons, but you did it in the wrong way. In my mind, I said, why? I talked to the treasurer, to the investors, 2 vice presidents, and the assistant to the president. And eventually, I shared this with somebody else. It became public. I think I defeat the system. I talked to the church board, Loma Linda University Church, conference, union, division, BRI, Juarez State, ministerial, and vice presidents. And let me tell you my experience going through the system, because everybody's excuse themselves, go to the system, go to your church. I did. Go to your conference, I did. Go to your union, I did. So I defeat the system. In every case, I can tell you that it's not the system that is wrong, it's the people. And your premise was that the people is good, but the system is bad. I disagree. And the system depends on the people. So I think that the people is what is wrong. I think everybody needs to have a chance to express themselves and do whatever they can. I stopped the investments on weapons and some other things at the level of the GC, but we need to do something greater. Do you have any comment?
Well, I first of all, I want to express appreciation to you because you do put energy into creating conversation with people, and that's a good thing. When you talk about people versus the system, you come on the side that the system is not so bad as the people. I think you've made a point that is worthwhile. Except I would probably argue, Eduardo, that the system is a big problem and the people in the system are a big problem, and we need to pray for the grace of God to heal both. Because I think people have, I mean, this is in a way, Jim Londis's point is that the big system ends up putting a kind of pressure on a GC president, particularly one who has a very simple theology. And it's hard under the pressure of that system to be the best that you can be. But you're right. The problems are in part due to the limitations of human beings, or maybe their refusal to listen. So thank you, Edward.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Sherry Craig. I don't hear from
Yes.
you, but you're on.
Yes.
What's going on in your mind? Because this is a controversial area.
Yes, it is. It's very interesting. And Chuck, I have to say that your description of the people who have left the church and will never come back definitely applies to me. You know, why I feel like I have to listen to this every week or almost every week. I still have to deal with that. But I mean, I can't say I was a person who just sat in the pew and never did anything. I know I'm not well known, but I coordinated 4 Association of Adventist Women's conferences, of the annual conferences, over about 30 years. And so I was very involved. I was trying to change the church into something that I wanted to be really for my child, for my grandchildren. It didn't turn out to be that. It never did. And I could no longer stay a part of it. But when you talk about the small churches are bad, are not good, or bad. for sure, that's true. But my membership is still at one of the largest churches in Central Florida. And yes, at one point, I think it had 5 of 10 pastors women. And people would say, well, you have women pastors in your church. Why won't you go? And the reason I wouldn't go is I could sit in church and watch Barbara McCoy up on the platform talking, and I couldn't get past the fact that the church was treating her like shit, that it would not recognize that she was as good or better than probably any other minister on that platform. And I couldn't go to it to see the women pastors being treated like that. So not only could I not go to the little churches, I couldn't deal emotionally with seeing what women were being treated as in the big churches. So there was no place to go. And so not only have I basically left the church, and I had to try to send my husband out of the room to say this because he has cognitive problems and it would upset him very, very much to listen to it. But I no longer even consider myself a Christian, but I still have to listen to what goes on here every week because it's such a part of what I've been over most of my 75 years. So, Chuck, thank you. It did describe me perfectly. That's all.
Thank you, Sherry. I feel your pain and others here as well. Thank you for contributing and sharing with us. Lauren, you're up again, but perhaps as it's getting close to that witching hour, sermon is over, but we still got some time left to chat. Would you have a brief benedictus for us?
Hey, about this time, Chuck, I usually tell people what's coming up in coming weeks, and we've got some really good programs. I twisted Ron Graybill's arm, and he's coming next week.
Oh,
He's
good.
been working on a piece about knowing what we know about Ellen White, the doubts that we have developed as we learned about the plagiarism and the things like that. The question comes then, what purpose does Ellen White have in our church and our life and in the culture that we have? And how do we make that meaningful? So that's kind of what he described to me. He hadn't pinned it down completely, but it's in that kind of general area. After that, Reinder Brisbane is coming back again. He's a very popular teacher. We always have a really good attendance when Reinder comes. After that, the first Sabbath in September is Dr. Pohler from Germany. And he hasn't given me a topic yet, but he's taught for us once before, and I think he taught quite regularly at the Faith and Reason class. So he's going to be coming back. And I also have one of our favorite teachers he's really a good teacher. I've often said I wish he had been my biology teacher, Brian Ness from Pacific Union College. A fun teacher, an interesting teacher. We really enjoy having him coming. He's going to be talking about what's the role of heredity in the kind of spiritual life that we have. Well, generally, the kind of life we have. Raising questions of determinism and predestination. To what degree does heredity tell us who we are and who we're going to be? That's a really interesting question. He's done a lot of work on this, and he's going to be bringing that to us. So you enjoy that. Let me go back to the topic at hand, Chuck, and something that happened today or the last couple of days since I was reading and editing your paper. Something occurred to me that had never occurred to me before. I always thought of women in ministry as being a justice issue on its own. It strikes me now that it is symbolic of who we are. It's got a symbolism that goes beyond just justice to women. It sort of describes, and this came from your paper, it sort of describes how it's emblematic of how we got into the situation we are today. It describes both the authoritarianism and the failure to be in conversation with the rest of the church, it seems to me. It's emblematic of something much bigger than just justice to women. Does that make sense?
Well, I think what you just said makes sense, namely that it has brought into bold relief a failure to embrace conversation.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's more than a simple putting on the scales of two different kind of justice. It's about, and another way to put it is this: we men, and we all bear responsibility. I mean, over time, men in the church have essentially shamed women by asserting of them that they have inadequate abilities when it comes to spiritual leadership. And actually, if you go back to the New Testament, the one meaning of the cross is this: the cross was a shameful way to die, and it was a shameful practice by the Roman Empire. And Jesus endured that shame and then overcame it. And in overcoming it, underscored how wrong-headed and even evil it is to tolerate any practice which involves unjust shaming of other people.
Oh, I like that. Yes. And
Well
there has
put.
been a shaming, not just of women, but also I have a concern for LGBTQ people, and have tried very hard to make them part of this group too, which again tends to push people in church leadership away because they don't like to be associated with us because we are open. We just a few weeks ago we had a trans woman be our presenter, and it was an excellent presentation, just deeply moving and very helpful. It strikes me that they have a very hard time with that. They don't want to be put in the position where they have to be deeply moved by somebody like that.
I hope that, Lauren, your example by incorporating such persons here and inviting others allows a lot of us to be on the right side of that judgment portrayed in Matthew 25. So thank you. Charlotte, I don't believe I've heard from you before, but I welcome your thoughts. Come on in and share with us. Thank you.
Well, Chuck and I go back a long, long way.
Yeah, we do. We're friends. She's been a colleague of mine. Thank you, and it's good to see you, Charlotte.
Good to see you again. I remember when Hygeth Williams was called to Sligo Church. And Hygeth tells the story about how she went to seminary. She graduated from, it was Columbia Union College at the time. And she decided to go to the seminary on her own. And she was told by fellow seminarians that you'll never get a call. You'll never get a call. And then she tells the story about how they would, some of her seminary, quote, friends would call her at 10 or 11 o'clock at night and pretend like they were conference presidents. And they would say, we have a call for you, Hygeth. Well, when Chuck called her to Sligo Church, he said, I'd like to invite you to come to Sligo Church. And Chuck, you can verify this for me because this is what Hyva said. She said that she slammed the phone down because she thought it was another joke.
Now,
And
if you're asking me to confirm that in its details, I will fail you because I don't have those memories. But I do have a firm memory of a phone call that seemed to her totally surprising.
yes, and you called her right back. And she answered the phone and took it that time. And she became a pastor at Sligo Church, one of our early women pastors. And Chuck, I'm going to tell you something that you don't know. When I was treasurer at Sligo Church, I would once in a while stumble upon letters that you had written. Now, when Chuck writes letters, they are beautiful letters. And I can tell you that his caring about the congregation came through in these letters. They were really beautifully written, and I just appreciated that so much. I've always appreciated Chuck anyway, for his leadership style. When we were at CUC together, WAU now, he always came every week to his administrators, sat down in our offices. He never asked us to go to his office. It was always he always came to our office. I always appreciated that in his leadership style. Thank you so much, Chuck.
Thank you.
Charlotte, thank you for expanding our perception of Chuck Scriven and for your work in leadership. Thank you. Carolyn Lacey, there's time for you. What have you got on your mind? What have we stirred up in that fertile mind? Carolyn, are you there? I'm not hearing you. I see you unmuted.
But Carolyn's microphone is not connected somehow.
Something's going wrong there.
Oh, there's Carolyn's face, but we can't hear her.
Work on that a little bit. I had that same problem last week. It is so frustrating. Work on that. I'll come back to you, and I'll ask Patty to unmute and share with us if she will while you work on that. Patty Tompkins? Not hearing any response there. Chuck, while we're waiting to get some things sorted out, your writings asked me to look on, and I did. And I asked myself, when you talk about ruts, no, new roads, yes, what is there as a precedent for the new in changing our course? Is this where we bring in the thought that Jesus taught about new wine in new bags? What is new? What's the opportunity for us individually with all this?
Well, I'm obviously the very things we're talking about would be new roads for Adventism. You know, a willingness to, let's say, conceive of faith in terms of embrace of a way of life, as opposed to thinking of it entirely in terms of doctrinal commitment. But I mean, the whole question of how we deal with the LGBTQ plus community, which is a far more difficult issue, by the way, than the issue of women in the church. And the reason I think it's more difficult because the Bible doesn't address those issues for the reason that there was no, as far as we can tell, real awareness of homosexuality. There were people who were in same-sex relationships, but there was no scientific awareness of homosexuality. The term homosexual, of course, wasn't invented. I've been told it was invented in the 19th century. I'm not sure when it was. But there are any number of new ways to think. I just finished a piece which I've been working with an editor, but it's a peer-reviewed journal, so the editor can't accept it by himself. You got to get somebody else to say it's okay, on how we understand Christian citizenship. And it was written out of the turmoil and the worry that we all have about the state of American politics. So there are, I think in Adventism, we've been so preoccupied with, well, Jim Landis's point, that we have to get the word out, and that somehow getting the word out will entail the second coming of Christ. We've been so preoccupied with that there are all kinds of issues that deal with the here and now that we should be exploring. And you can practically tick off a list. And ironically, we already have been participants in here and now issues in some respects. And that includes medicine, healthcare, diet, and all that. But I mean, we have our top leaders basically ignore the Hebrew prophets. If they can somehow dig a prophecy that is predictive about the future out of the Hebrew prophets, they might take them seriously. But the basic ethos of the Hebrew prophets, which was an objection to big people stepping on little people, they just overlook it. So it's endless. I mean, the new roads are stretching out in front of us. And also, and let's pick one that's typical of our life together. I think further consideration of the Sabbath day can be itself a new road, because what the Sabbath could do for Adventists, and in some ways has done, is keep us in close touch with not just the Old Testament, but not just the Old Testament, but the whole idea of the Jews. The fact is that typically, leaving aside for the moment the incredible pain associated with the conflict in Israel, typically Jews in the 20th century have deserved tremendous admiration for the moral conviction that is displayed there. There are all kinds of ways that even the most conventional of Adventist doctrines can become new roads that lead us out of ruts. But they don't lead us, they don't necessarily lead us away from what could be the substance of a community's life that takes the Sabbath seriously, or even that takes apocalyptic literature seriously. So there's new roads everywhere.
I think it broadens our rut into a pathway, dare we say it, a road, or maybe a freeway someday. We can hope.
Yeah.
Clifford, you've tuned in. We've been talking about you.
Well, Chuck and I, hearing Chuck's voice, I don't know if he wants to let on.
No, I don't mind. I was tempted to say something about you earlier.
Yeah, well, we hang out. I don't want to soil your reputation here by telling them how much we hang out together, but that's another. Listen, before I say anything, I've got to have this. I am not speaking for the general conference. I am speaking for myself. They would probably not be thrilled that I'm on here. And if you don't need to say anything, I would appreciate it very much. But look, it's so funny. When I sometimes get on here, I am fascinated. I'm fascinated by these conversations, and it really has been eye-opening to me, because if any of you know anything about me, I didn't become an Adventist until I was in my mid-20s. I had a very dramatic experience. I was read light to the Adventist church, and I've been 40 years now at the GC, 44 years in the church. And I've had a wonderful experience here. It's been Adventism was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. and the truths it's taught me, I couldn't get anywhere else. I realized that not everybody has had that experience. I wasn't raised in the church. I wasn't hung up. Sometimes my wife and I would get an argument for something, and I'd say, "Don't lay your Adventist guilt on me." And she'd say, "Well, maybe you need a little more Adventist guilt because I wasn't raised with that." But anyway, it is fascinating to me. That's not really what I want to say. My main point was it has been helpful to me to be a lot more sympathetic to people who have had a rougher time in the church. It was something that has been, and Lauren, some of the stuff you've written, even recently, has helped me to become more aware of this. And Chuck, we spend a lot of time together, and you guys have opened my eyes up to something. But really, there was only one point, and it's not even that big of a deal, that I wanted to bring up. You know, I don't want to get into the women's ordination thing per se, but when I got to the GC after 4 years in the church, I didn't know this church. I was clueless. And I come to this building and they were having all these meetings. And I remember they were shipping people in from all over the world. And what they were doing, they were having meetings about the question of women's ordination. And I remember, I mean, I'm clueless. I really am. But I remember coming away feeling very impressed, just at the sense that they were bringing all these people. And now you might not like, obviously, how it turned out, and you might not. But I guess all this comes down to the question that, well, it means we're not talking to each other. And I just, from the experience I've had, that's not what I've seen. But anyway, really, that was the only point I wanted to make. I remember I was a little bit blown away by, wow, they're having all these committees and the meetings and so on and so forth. And whatever. That's just how it came to me. I don't know if somebody wants to respond, but that's all.
Thank you for that insight, because that's relevant. Chuck?
Well, I think that what Clifford is talking about both exemplifies a possibility and illustrates a drawback, because they weren't bringing everybody in. They were bringing some lay people, and there was an effort to give some voice to some theologians, but there was no effort, as far as I could see, and I wasn't an insider at all, but to actually go out, for example, and interact in good faith exchange. I remember that at one point there was a meeting in the Pacific Union where Elder Wilson showed up, but he showed up precisely to try to block an effort that was being made out there. That's perfect.
Could I say something, Chuck?
Yeah.
I want to enter. I'm talking 40 years ago. Yeah, I'm talking a good 25 years before Ted, when there were two NAD presidents who were pro-women's ordination. No, I think even three, or maybe even, let me see. I came in under Brad. I think he was for it.
Yeah, but Brad is the best thing we ever. Brad was good for us.
Anyway, go ahead.
I concede your point that you're speaking of something that did happen in the past, and it was substantially healthy to have those conversations.
Okay, yeah, that's what I remember.
That, but the point is, we haven't had anything similar lately, and in any case, the conversations have to be a matter of good faith exchange, not just formal papers, and then someone gets up and says thank you and goes home. It's just like we do in American politics. You know what I wish would happen in American politics? I'll just pick something out of the blue. The conversation I want to see is one in which Laura Ingraham and let us say Joe, I just lost the last name.
Scarborough.
Yeah, Joe Scarborough, sit down, no moderator. They're at a table. They've been given a topic and they talk to each other. That's what we need in the church. We need conversation. Formal paper presentation is good. I like to write formal papers, but what we need is conversation involving players of all kinds. But yeah, there was a kind of a conversation at one point. You're right, Clifford.
Well, I will renew my invitation to you, Cliff. I would like you to come and teach here. I'm looking for people who have from the General Conference staff who have the courage to do that. I've invited so many of you to do it. You will get some tough questions, but you'll also get a lot of affirmation from this group too. Sorry, you muted again, and I need to. Anyway, we're almost finished here, so let me just throw one thing in here. I'm going to go back to something that we talked about before, Chuck, and that is the role of congregations.
Mm-hmm.
You made quite a point in your paper that people need to find good congregations,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to say I love that idea. My partner in writing Adventist today is Bjorn Karlman, and Bjorn has a congregation that he really likes around Newbold, and he and his family really enjoy it a lot and participate in it. When I go out to California, I go to La Sierra University Church, or I go to Glendale City Church. I actually moved my membership to Glendale City Church because it was the only fully accepting church that I knew. And so I love those churches. However, I'm going to give you a statistic that ought to shock all of you. Now think about this carefully. This is something that I learned from Marty Celine. It was true. He first discovered it 10 years ago, and it continues to be true to this day, probably worse than it was then. And it is this: six out of 10 Seventh-day Adventists are in 1 out of 10 congregations. Think about that. 1/10 of the congregations, 1 out of 10 congregations contain 60% of us. That means we have some fantastically big congregations with lots of interesting people and big staffs. But think about the other 40% who are spread across 90% of the congregations of the denomination. So when I heard that, I thought that was crazy. That can't be true. So I actually sat down with the Ohio Conference list, and it was even more extreme than that. 1/4 of our congregations, actually, no, we had 100 congregations. 10 out of those congregations accounted for 60% of our tithe, and 60%, 70% of our attendance. That's you lived here in Ohio, Chuck, and I'm sure you went to the Kettering Church. Kettering, Worthington, Centerville, Toledo, a handful of the Beaverton. Is it Beaverton? Yeah, Beaver something. Accounted for almost all of that. And I spent about a year traveling around the conference preaching. And I went to church after church where there are fewer than 10 people in the congregation. So I just want you all to understand that there is no sense of evenness across the churches in the denomination. There is a huge gap. We have very little in the middle. We have a bunch of big churches, and we have a vast number, 90% of churches. I would say 90% of our churches in Ohio right now probably have fewer than 20 people in worship this morning. So this is what we're up against, Chuck, when we talk about congregations being a community where you can really find yourself. Most of them are old and most of them are dying.
And Lauren, that reality is why we welcome ATSS. Chuck, is there anything that you'd like to say in challenging us or in closing?
Not particularly. Let me just respond to the point that Lauren has made. It illustrates inattention to congregational life in official Adventism. It also illustrates that the version of Adventism that is sometimes instantiated in the larger churches, like the one in Worthington, is one which people are attracted to. I mean, the fact is that there's whatever there were nearly 150 people here today at one point, I think.
Mhm.
That's evidence that there is something about the Adventist culture that is attractive. And maybe we can build whatever hope by God's grace we can muster on the fact that longer term Adventists who maintain their connections with bigger churches or with Zoom congregations like this, they are testament to the possibility that an Adventist way of life can become attractive again. This morning, when Dwayne McBride of Andrews was sharing with the Sligo class the results of a particular canvassing of our class only, and then a comparison of the results with the wider church, there were some very marked differences, a lot of them having to do with doctrine. But on the other hand, there was a lot of an embrace of much of Adventist culture by this class. Very committed to healthful living, very pleased to experience the Sabbath day. There's a reason, I think, for hope. But having said that, I think any betting man or woman who lives by entirely worldly versions of epistemology or the theory of knowledge would probably not bet on our future. That would not be a smart bet from the standpoint of worldly epistemology. All we have is hope, the discipline of hope. And I hope, can hold on to it. But it's not easy because the system is really stacked against the kinds of reforms we're hoping for. It's not easy. This class is extremely valuable, however, because it brings together a lot of good thinking people, and it's a blessing. It's a gift from God.